A special guest, I believe, out of Australia, Jonathan Hainsworth, eye patch and all, is joining me now on the live line. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, Miss Regan. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here, dude. You love history, don't you?
I do. I'm a history teacher at high school.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love history, not just modern history, but history that talks about the quaint, the things that people consider, that was criminal, so that's not considered history. I think Jack the Ripper is a huge part of history, don't you?
I do, in the sense that we can learn a lot about the era that he committed his terrible crimes in.
Very hard to catch somebody back in those days, wasn't it?
It was hard because, Scotland Yard had hundreds of men trying to catch this murderer of poor, defenceless women who were driven into prostitution by poverty in London's slum, Whitechapel. But it is an era before they had fingerprint identification or even able to differentiate between blood types. You almost had to catch someone in the act who was a serial killer, because a serial killer has no connection to their victims until they are their victims. So we can understand why it was difficult to catch him.
Yeah, well, it's still difficult to catch them. It takes forever, and we have everything at our fingertips right now, from DNA to you name it. And we still have a hard time catching them. But how many murders in your mind, do you think he did and got away with?
Well, it was thought at the time, between 1888 and 1891, that he committed about 12 murders. And it was only in that year of 1891 that a Scotland Yard police chief was able to track down the actual killer of 5 of those 12 victims, and discovered that the man that a hoax letter had called Jack the Ripper was in fact deceased, and had been deceased since the end of 1888. He drowned himself in the Thames as a police dragnet closed in on him, although they didn't have his name. And so, although there was a dozen murders, this man who did it, this gentleman above suspicion, he actually did 5 murders before taking his own life.
So, why Jack the Ripper? What's so interesting about him that you decided to put together a book?
Well, a couple of things. We discovered things about Montague Druitt, that's the man who was the murderer. Mm-hmm. We discovered that he, being a defense lawyer, he himself had defended a murderer in court and had tried to get his client off by blaming a woman who was a sex worker. And we think that might have, because he failed in that case, and that might have been part of the trigger for the way he turned towards the poor women of Whitechapel. But also beyond that, we discovered that at the time in 1888, a lot of people at the time, like George Bernard Shaw, the famous writer, they were convinced that the murderer had to be some sort of socialist-inspired killer, because he was only killing in a particular, very narrow part of that slum in order to draw attention to the upper classes, how awful the conditions were. And so he's actually more like Jack the Socialist and a terrorist.
Who would look at a guy named Montague Druitt and think he was a serial killer? You know what I mean? He had like the perfect cover.
His nickname was Monty.
Yeah, he had the perfect cover. All right, but
Perfect cover.
He did get away with this for a long time, and I know it was partially because it was so hard to prove, but that's not the only reason, according to your book.
No, that's right. He was arrested, we think, on the night that he managed to kill 2 defenceless women. And he got away with it because of the nature of British society then, which was all about pedigree. And because he was the nephew of a very famous doctor, he was able to bluff his way to freedom, even though he had bloodstains on him. Probably they let him go with an apology, because he was a gentleman. In fact, of course, he was a monstrous figure.
So he was standing there covered in blood, and he's like, I'm a medical student helping in the poor. So the cop's like, I'm sorry, sir. Carry on your way.
Yeah. Can we assist? Can we help you back to your legal chambers? I mean, it could have been something like that. Now, that police chief who worked it out years later, that's why the book is called The Escape of Jack the Ripper, the truth about the cover-up and his flight from justice, in that the police chief was determined that the public would know that it was a gentleman who had been the murderer, but he didn't want the specific name to be known because it was so embarrassing to the police that they had come so close to catching him and hadn't caught him, that he had got away.
So this whole thing has always interested me. There have been there have been so many movies, there have been books, there have been so many things put out by him that just terrorize us about Jack the Ripper. But when it comes right down to it, he was just a dude. He was just a dude, and he was nuts. And that's basically it.
Yes, except he's high functioning. I mean, he's still a part-time school teacher, and he's a part-time and very successful lawyer. Mm-hmm. And he's also a brilliant athlete and plays cricket. And he's also a serial killer.
Golly.
And he's turned on by socialist ideas. I don't mean to say that that's what he seriously was, but that's how he justified it in his own mind, why he kept returning to the same slum which was now crawling with police, because he believed that he was promoting a socialistic agenda. But our book is also very much about his family, who discover that their member is a serial killer and are desperately trying to figure out what to do. Can we put him in a mental institution? Should we turn him in? So that's also a part of the story that's never been told before.
Well, and I love that because I think every family listening right now, mine included, we have a couple people in our family who should probably be behind bars or who are doing nefarious things, but we don't want to tell on them for the most part, and it's hard and embarrassing to admit that it's the real deal.
Yes.
Where'd you
that's why in the book, sorry.
Where'd you get these pictures? They fascinated me.
They are the pictures of him come from where he won a scholarship at a very elite boys' school, Winchester, and other photos we picked up from different places and different archives in England, in West Sussex, and we think the pictures are terrific of the family, which some have never been published before.
That's fantastic. The old pictures always just suck me in, and I stare at them. It takes me longer to stop staring at the pictures than it usually does to read the books, because I find people fascinating, not just how they looked, but the way no one ever smiled. And everyone just seemed to be sad and dreary and just unhappy back in those days.
That was the convention, not to smile. And there's a wonderful picture of him, or I should say a sinister picture of him, when he's a little boy staring at the camera, and he looks like something out of The Omen.
It's true. I never thought about that. That's true. He's like 16 or something like that.
Yeah, or even younger. There's one of him about 10, and he looks like a little sort of devil child, and it's probably very unfair. He probably wasn't unhinged yet. But anyway, that's what the picture looks like.
You know what? I think when you're as unhinged as this guy was, your hinge came loose at a pretty young age. It just didn't come to fruition. I wonder how he chose his targets. And I realize you said it was these impoverished socialist ideas where women would basically have sex with somebody because they were starving to death. They just wanted something to eat.
Yes.
But why kill them? Why not help them instead? Because he could have.
I think, absolutely. In fact, he joined a charity group in the East End, in the Whitechapel district, to assist people who were in poverty. But we think that he obviously had a sick and deranged and cowardly aspect to him, where he wanted to strangle these women and then do terrible things to their remains in the street. And that's why it became a worldwide sensation, that these crimes were so atrocious and so public. But we think that, as we said before, that he was drawn to do it in that particular area in order to draw the attention. This is how he justified it himself. It's like terrorists today who never actually go to a mosque and never actually stop drinking, but they'll drive their truck through 80 people on a beach and say, I'm doing it for my God. Mm-hmm. He's like that. He's not really doing anything political, but he justifies it to himself that I'm a social reformer and I'm a terrorist, and evil is used to create good and all that sort of terrible nonsense.
I hate that. And, the murders were gruesome, folks. I don't know if any of you, while you're reading this book, you'll find out more about Jack the Ripper, the way he got away with it for so long. I understand that because of the time in which they lived and how difficult it was to solve a crime. I actually do get that and wasn't surprised by it. But he chopped them up. I mean, it was just gruesome.
Yes, deliberately so. But we think that he died, though, in a tormented state over what he had done.
Good. I mean, really?
Yes, and because a police dragnet was closing in on the asylum he was in.
Yeah. Well, guys like this always think they're smarter than the police, and eventually the police catch up with them. But there's a whole twist to this, because do you think somebody murdered this Alice Mackenzie girl after the fact to try to make it look like they were wrong about Druitt?
Well, I think they didn't know about Druitt at that point. So we just think that there are several murders after Druitt's suicide, and it's the police who make the mistake of thinking, well, that's the same killer, not realizing that the killer of the first 5 victims is already dead. And so it took that police chief a couple of years later to work out that they're copycat murders.
See, and in my mind, I felt like the person who did it knew that it was Druitt, but wanted to draw attention away to keep him in his gentlemanly thought. You know what I mean?
No,
conspiracy
we think that from the research, that that's a good theory, but it's just not backed up by what we found. But certainly, you're correct in thinking that somebody killed a prostitute and they tried to make it look like Jack the Ripper had done it.
Yeah, all right. Where's this book available?
So you can get it from Amazon. You can get it from the local bookshop because it came out today in your country, and you can get it from online stores, and you can order it from Regnery History Books publisher.
Okay, his name is Jonathan Hainsworth, spelled H-A-I-N-S Worth, W-R-T-H. You wrote it with Christine Ward Agius, right?
That's right. She wrote 50% of it and did 99% of the research.
So she deserves some accolades this morning as well. But what's your favorite part of the book? What did you enjoy figuring out the most or surmising the most?
I think that what we most enjoyed was discovering something that had never been found before, and was found by an American researcher called Roger Palmer. Well, we expanded upon it, and that was that the Druitt family, desperately scrambling to do something with their Montague, and so they put him in a very expensive asylum in France to just get him out of the way, because if they just handed him into the police and the press got a hold of it, their reputations would have been ruined. Their lives would have been ruined.
Right.
So they put him in the French asylum, and it all backfired because one of the nurses could speak English and understood what he was confessing to, and so they had to extract him from that and bring him back to London. We think that's a very fascinating chapter.
All right. So, and you right now, are you in London or are you in Australia?
We are in Adelaide, South Australia.
Okay. And so what time is it there?
It's about 11:22 in the evening.
Oh, my goodness. Thanks for staying up so late with us. But this story, it had me turning pages and turning pages because everybody's read and heard and watched movies about Jack the Ripper, but you're going to learn some new stuff, and there's some truth in here that I'm not sure why, but maybe you can tell me, Jonathan. Why were people so unafraid to tell the truth about how this was covered up?
Well, I think that the police chief and his upper-class friends, one of whom was related to the Druitts by marriage, they did want the public to know that this murderer was not what prejudice said he was, a foreigner or an immigrant or Jewish or poor. They did want to share with the public that he was one of us, the so-called better classes, and like it or lump it. Mm-hmm. It's Jack the cricketer, not Jack the Jew, and you just have to accept that. And that's where the iconic image of the Ripper as a man in a top hat and a cape carrying a medical bag comes from.
All right, and there are a lot of theories that he got Epsteined. He didn't kill himself, or he was murdered by someone else. So where do you buy into that?
Well, we just found no evidence for that whatsoever. What really happened was that he was in a tormented state. I'm not suggesting we should be particularly sympathetic to Montague Druitt at that moment, but that's what the research shows. He was tormented by what he had done, and he confessed to his cousin, who was a Church of England priest, and he said, I want the truth to come out within 10 years. And then he went and drowned himself in the Thames, and then that cousin tried to bring out the truth a decade later, and that's where a lot of our research comes from, and how we know what we know, and what's in the book.
Yeah, and the bottom line is a lot of what's in the book they could not possibly have known unless the killer himself said something about it. And that's when I find books the most interesting, when they point out something that I've never heard about a case before. Therefore, I have to wonder, they couldn't possibly know that unless somebody who was there told them that.
Correct. And also, nobody wanted it to be Montague Druitt. His family didn't want it to be him. The police chief, who had a friend married to the Druitts, didn't want it to be him. And yet, in the end, they couldn't ignore the evidence that it was him. And therefore, we want the public to know, but we don't want the public to know his name.
Mm-hmm. Beware the perfect gentleman. Beware, ladies.
Yes, the perfect gentleman, beware.
Jonathan Hainsworth, one of the authors, with Christine Ward Agius. It's The Escape of Jack the Ripper, the truth about the cover-up and his flight from justice. It reads like a movie. It will play through your brain like a movie while you're reading it, and you will love this book. So everybody get a copy. Again, it's available at Amazon and many other places. If you just Google The Escape of Jack the Ripper, you're going to be able to find it. Jonathan, pleasure to talk to you today, sir. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, man, for having us.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.